Oops. Hi everyone. So, what we're going to be doing today, maybe we can go to this one for a little bit here before we get started. So, it is 3:30, which as you all know, it is time for one of our after-school STEM shows. And so, basically what these are is that every day at 3:30 we go live with one of the educators here at the Science Center, and we do some sort of STEM adjacent topic. So different days get different educators. It's been me a lot lately because there's been a lot of vacation time happening and people out sick and stuff. So it's been me a bunch lately, but if you keep tuning in, you'll see all the different educators coming in and talking about stuff. And depending on the educator, or even just depending on the day, you're going to get different topics. You're going to get different perspectives, even if it is the same topic being covered more than once. So it's worth tuning in. You know, even if you tune in one day and the content's maybe not for you, tune in the next day, maybe it will be. And today's a little bit of a weird one. Again, we are had someone call in sick today, so we're a little short-staffed here at the Science Center today. And so what we're going to be doing is going through and doing a review of a video that I made for the Science Center, and I was looking at the date on it right before we started, and I made it almost exactly 11 months ago. And so that's like right at the start of quarantine, and so this is actually the first video that I really made for the Science Center. We did a couple little like short kind of social media, just posted to Facebook type of videos before this, but as far as like a situation where I made a video specifically for the Headwaters Science Center and uploaded it, this is the first one I did. So it's really honestly the first video I really did at all in any capacity. And so we're going to look at it, see what we think about it, you know, almost a year on. What are some things that we like about it? What are some things that maybe are we'd change upon a remake? So we'll switch here and we'll get it started. Hi everybody, welcome to Raptor. So, starting off here right away, interesting thing with like these really early videos we were making is that all of them were shot on my personal camera. And I just have like a little knockoff camcorder that I bought on Amazon for like $70. And one of the things that was an issue for it for a long time that we just could not figure out was that it shot everything in this deeply, deeply red color. We found out like after weeks and weeks of shooting with this thing. And so if you look at a lot of the older videos on the YouTube channel, or from this period, they're all kind of have this issue where they're super red. There's an issue with the camera where there was like a setting buried deep in the menus that we just didn't find for ages that was making everything be this red color. So that's why it's red. I didn't know how to fix it in post at the time. Like I said, it's like my first video. Ryan's room, a show where I find stuff around my apartment and talk to you about them in a science segment. In this episode, we've got these two basketball jerseys. So, what are we looking at? This is a jersey that was worn by the NBA's Toronto Raptors in the like mid to late 90s. It's their original jersey that they wore when they were first coming into the league. And first off, I mean, if you have any comments or questions or anything, feel free to throw them in chat. I'm looking at both Twitch and Facebook chat right now, so if you've got anything, throw them in there and I'll make sure to respond to it. But I guess the other kind of thing before we really get into this one is kind of what the idea was for this series was it's COVID content. Like we are shut down at the time that I am making this video, and at the time one of the things we were kind of trying to push was we wanted to kind of personify the Science Center. We were trying to like put a more human face on it, and kind of an idea we had with that was like, yeah, do something that is like a little bit more personalized to the educators. So we were at the time like shooting interviews with the educators that ended up really not going up anywhere. And my thing that I was going to do was going to be this series, which while I'm, you know, locked in my apartment here, see all the weird stuff that I just have sitting around my apartment. That is a little insight into who I am outside of the Science Center. But also it was meant to be sort of put forth this idea that, you know, even if you can't come into the Science Center, even if you're not in your, you know, classroom science, like as long as you're like curious and have the energy and willpower to like go read about a thing, go look a thing up, there's science all around you. There's stuff to be learned all around you. And so this is like, yeah, a basketball jersey. So the idea was I find things that are just around my apartment that are, you know, not necessarily at face value super like sciencey, and try and talk about them in a sciencey way, as I say in the intro. And what I think is kind of interesting about it is the dinosaur is on the front. Obviously, it's intended to be a raptor. What you may or may not know is that raptor isn't actually like a specific dinosaur, it's actually like a whole family of dinosaurs. So what I'm hoping to do is figure out exactly what species this dinosaur is. So we're going to be looking at the physical features that we can see right here on the logo and using them to see if we can't narrow down that dinosaur to a specific species. So I bought this one in what would have been, I think, 2012. That like behind the scenes kind of look at the thing is also why like this segment is in there. It gets dramatically shortened in the later ones. I was in college at the time. I was doing my bachelor's at University of North Dakota. And I had a roommate, and we used to play NBA 2K together. We were playing NBA 2K12. And we would play the franchise mode. So it's a mode in the game where you take control of a franchise and control it for multiple different seasons. And in our franchise mode we were playing, I was playing as the Toronto Raptors. Kind of just randomly, to be honest. I just kind of picked a team. But we just happened to walk into the Goodwill in Grand Forks during that time and happened to find this on the rack. And like I said, I was playing as the Toronto Raptors at the time. It's in my size. It's actually a Tracy McGrady jersey, who was one of my favorite players when I was a kid. So it was also like less than $10. It just seemed like too good of a deal to pass up, so I scooped it up. This one I got much more recently. So despite owning two Toronto Raptors jerseys, my favorite NBA team was actually the Milwaukee Bucks. And the Milwaukee Bucks played the Toronto Raptors in the playoffs last year, so 2018-2019. And I made a bet with a friend of mine where if the Bucks won that series, then he would have to buy a Bucks jersey. But if the Raptors won, then I had to buy a Raptors jersey. Obviously, I have the jersey, which means that the Raptors won. So yeah, I've only had this one for about a year. It's a Vince Carter jersey, if you're curious, the second one. So the larger field of science that we're going to be working with today is biology, the study of living things. But if you wanted to narrow it down to a subfield, or maybe even call this just like a practice, what we're going to be dealing with is called cladistics. And what cladistics is this way that scientists sort living things based on how closely related we think they are to one another. And so you can put this on a chart, you can make what's called a cladogram. And what a cladogram ends up looking like is basically a family tree, except instead of having like little individual people on it, it ends up having entire species, so showing how closely related different species are to one another. And the whole practice of cladistics is basically rooted in one core assumption, and that is that the more physical traits two living things have with one another, the more closely related they probably are. So generally... So that last line is kind of an interesting one, because I specifically say it's about physical traits, and that's true-ish, especially with kind of older models of cladistics. These days it's getting to be more and more dependent on like genome stuff. Genetic similarity to one another ends up being more what gets used now. So, like I said, it still holds true-ish, but is maybe not the way I would have phrased that if I was to remake this. But like I said, there's a whole history of doing this, and most of it happens before, mapping genomes is a thing. So, and there's still a lot of cladograms out there that have not really been affected too terribly much by genome mapping because there just hasn't been the time to do it yet. So a lot of cladograms out there are still largely dependent on physical traits, but it's kind of getting phased out at this point. Really, the smallest group that you're going to be working with when you're talking about cladistics is going to be called a species. And so just to sort of practice how this works, why don't we start out with a species that I know we're all familiar with, the human. And so human obviously is what we would say I am, what you are.
But that's not the only thing you could say that we are and have that be true. You could also say that we are apes. And so apes would include not only humans, but also the closest relatives of humans.
Good cut there in the audio.
Things like chimpanzees and orangutans and gorillas and gibbons. You could also say that we're primates. And so this is a group that would include all the animals I just mentioned, humans and all the other apes, but also then on top of that include things like monkeys and lemurs. An even bigger group that you could say we're a part of is the mammals. And so this is a group that we share with, again, all the apes and all the primates, but also things like dogs and cats and horses and whales. Anything that's furry and produces milk, basically. Bigger still would be saying that we are vertebrates. And so these are animals that have their skeletons on the inside, have what's called an endoskeleton.
This is another interesting one where I define vertebrate as an animal that has an endoskeleton, which, like I said, is a skeleton on the inside. And this is one that I kind of fussed over for a long time. Like that one line I spent a really disproportionate amount of time on because I was trying to find a good definition for what a vertebrate is. And typically, like, the way you hear it is a vertebrate's an animal with a backbone. And that is true. Any animal with a backbone is a vertebrate, but there's also vertebrates that don't have bones at all, which gets talked about a little bit later. So you can think about, like, a shark has a fully cartilage skeleton, so they don't actually have backbones. They don't actually have vertebra. They just have sort of this, like, sheath of cartilage around their entire spinal cord. So I said I kind of agonized over this a while and settled on the endoskeleton definition, which even on itself isn't really right because there are non-vertebrates that have endoskeletons, like sea stars, for example, have an endoskeleton. But, I picked a definition and I went with it. If you really wanted to get proper with it, it's probably something along the lines of, like, animals that have a spinal cord that is, like, surrounded by a sheath of bone or cartilage is probably the best definition, but it doesn't feel very elegant to me.
So these are all the mammals, every animal we've mentioned up until now, plus things like fish and birds and reptiles, amphibians. They would all fit in with this group too. And then, of course, we are animals. And so now we're including everything we've already mentioned, but then also including animals that don't have internal skeletons. So things like jellyfish and worms and insects and spiders. All of these things are animals, even though they don't have internal skeletons like we do. And then finally, the biggest group of all would just be saying that we're alive. And so this would be a group that includes everything that has ever lived on planet Earth. And so this is including all the animals, but also things like plants and fungi and bacteria and viruses. These are all things that are living, and so are all a part of kind of this big global family tree that I've been talking about, even though our last relative that we share probably existed almost 1 billion years ago. So now that we kind of know what we're doing, why don't we go back to the raptor? And for him, we're basically going to do the same thing that we just did with the human, except instead of starting with the small group and working our way to a big group, we're going to go the opposite way. So we're going to start out with the very biggest group, just saying that it is alive, and then we're going to work our way smaller and smaller as far as we can go. And the raptor is, of course, just like our human was, an animal. And we kind of just recognize it as being an animal. That's something that, you can kind of look at it and just tell. But just for the sake of having something we can point to and say this definitively proves that this is an animal, we can take a look at its eyes. And now, eyes are something that not every animal has. Like a jellyfish, for example, doesn't have any eyes. But eyes are something that only animals have. You won't ever see a plant with eyes or a fungus with eyes. So the fact that the raptor has eyes puts it very squarely in the animal category. And again, just like the human, the raptor is a vertebrate. And if you remember what a vertebrate is, that is an animal that has an internal skeleton. The hard structural parts that let it stand up are on the inside rather than on the outside. And the thing we can look to on our logo that tells us for sure that it is a vertebrate is that it has teeth. And teeth themselves aren't really a part of the skeleton, but there needs to be a skeleton in order for an animal to have teeth. They need something to sit in, they need something to be attached to. So like for humans, we have a bone in our jaw called a mandible, and the mandible is where the teeth sit. And
so a question you might have with this is that we think of a number of different invertebrate things as having teeth. So like people think of like spiders, spider fangs. So like spider fangs aren't technically teeth. They're just like part of the exoskeleton that is just like shaped kind of like a tooth. Is maybe something I should have defined more clearly in this, is that, you know, when I say teeth, I am referring to a specific scientific definition of tooth that doesn't necessarily reflect the way that most people might use that word.
And I would assume that our raptor has a pretty similar setup, even though we can't see his skeleton right now. And before we move on with classifying our raptor, I just want to take a quick sidebar here. You might have noticed that I've been trying really hard not to say the word bones when I've been talking about vertebrates. I've been saying internal skeleton or endoskeleton. And that's because not every vertebrate actually has bones. Most of them do, but there are specifically a few types of fish that don't have any bones at all. Sharks are probably the most famous of these, but one that we actually have locally is the chestnut lamprey. And so fish that don't have bones, like sharks and chestnut lampreys, do still have an internal skeleton. They still have an endoskeleton. Theirs is just made of entirely cartilage. And so cartilage is something that we have in our bodies too. Probably easiest spot to find it is in your ears or on your nose. So like how you can kind of crumple your ear up and it kind of snaps back into shape, a shark's or a lamprey's entire skeleton is made out of that stuff. Also, cool thing about lampreys, they're one of the few vertebrates around today that don't have any jaws either. They actually are from a time before the jaw developed. So instead they just have this sort of ring of cartilage that all their teeth are stuck into. Lampreys are super cool. They've been around pretty much in the same form they are now for like 400 million years. They found a life plan and they've stuck to it, and it's really worked out for them. Anyway, now that I scared you with a lamprey mouth, let's get back to our raptor. So he basically sorts vertebrates into 4 big groups. There's fish, there's reptiles, there's amphibians, and there's mammals. Alright, so let's try and eliminate these groups one at a time. Let's start with fish. So one of the signature...
Where are the birds, you might be asking? A lot of current literature doesn't recognize birds as being their own distinct class and puts them as a subclass within the reptiles. So that's why there's only 4 here rather than there being a class for birds.
Signature things about fish is that they, of course, live underwater.
Also, I couldn't find an image in this same style that was of a bird.
They have gills instead of lungs so that they can breathe underwater instead of on land. Another signature thing that comes with that for fish is that they have fins instead of arms and legs, and these are more useful for them when it comes to moving around in water. So let's take a look at our raptor again and see how he lines up with that. And obviously right away you can tell that our raptor does not have fins, it has legs. Also it's dribbling a basketball, which would not work underwater because the basketball would float. So we can confidently say that the raptor is not a fish. Next, let's take a look at amphibians. And sort of the signature thing about amphibians that separates them away from the rest of the vertebrates is that they're a group that, when they're born, they live in the water. So the adults lay their eggs in the water, and when they hatch, they come out with gills and sort of fins, basically. And they live in the water until they reach adulthood, and then they'll grow legs and come out onto land. Can't really tell if our raptor ever did that. We don't really get a chance to look at what he looked like throughout his life, just based on the logo we've got. But one other lesser known trait about amphibians is that they actually don't have any claws or fingernails, which is kind of unique actually.
And there is actually one exception to that, and we actually have a couple of them at the Science Center now, which are African clawed frogs. And they fully independently from any of the rest of the amphibians developed claws on their back feet that they mostly use just for like digging around in the bottom of the lake bottom. But yeah, so there is actually one type of amphibian that has claws, but they're seemingly not at all related to the claws that mammals and reptiles have.
And that's something we can look to at our logo because it's a good physical trait. And again, just taking a quick look at our logo, we can see that our raptor does in fact have claws on both his hands and his feet. And so that leaves us with 2 groups left, the reptiles and the mammals. And this one's tricky because a lot of the things that separate reptiles and mammals are things that are either internal, so we wouldn't be able to see them in the logo, or aren't necessarily like real hard rules that are really easy to spot in something as stylized as a logo. So of course, like the signature mammal trait is having fur. But there's a lot of mammals out there that have very little fur or have very fine fur that you wouldn't immediately look at and say, yeah, that's a furry animal, something like a whale. Something like being warm-blooded, like making their own body heat, is something that mammals do and most reptiles don't, but some reptiles do to some degree, so it's not really a great rule to use for something like this. Plus, we can't really tell based on our logo if our animal is warm or cold-blooded. One thing, though, that we do have as a physical trait that we can look at is the ears. Remember when we were talking about cartilage back with the lamprey and I told you to grab onto your ear and kind of bend it? That's something that a snake or a lizard couldn't do because they don't have that big floppy part on the outside of their ear. They just have kind of a hole in the side of their head, and that is their ear. And this is something that is true across the board for reptiles. There's not any reptiles that have that big floppy external part of their ear, and most mammals do have that. Again, of course, there are exceptions. But as far as I know, the only mammals that don't have that are ones that primarily live in water. And so things like whales don't have big floppy parts on the outside of their head to be ears, or dolphins or seals. And that's an adaptation that they have specifically for living underwater. And as we established by the fact that our raptor is dribbling a basketball, we do know that it does not live underwater. So we will call our raptor a reptile. So now we need to find something about our raptor that is unique even among the reptiles. And this is where we're starting to get into some really fine details here. So there's a lot of reptiles out there that have teeth, there's a lot of them out there that have claws, there's a lot that have tails and eyes and things like that. But something that our raptor has that is pretty unique is that it can actually stand upright. So if you think about other reptiles that you know, things like lizards and alligators and snakes, they spend pretty much all their time with their bellies on the ground. Even when they're walking, their arms kind of stick out to their side and their bellies never get
have the
more than
sideways
a little
and down
couple inches
arms.
off the ground. So being able to stand upright and
Doing
dribble a
push-ups all the time
is kind of a unique thing for a reptile. And the reptiles that are able to do things like that, able to stand upright, are of course the dinosaurs.
I fully didn't know that that was the defining trait for dinosaur until I was making this. Is that what makes a dinosaur rather than any of the other archosaur groups like crocodilians is strictly that dinosaurs, the defining characteristic is their legs are up underneath them and they can walk upright in a way that a crocodile can't. Didn't know till I made this, so even I learned something making this.
And the dinosaurs are a group that I'm sure you're familiar with. They were a very prominent group of reptiles on this planet for 200 plus million years. And that being able to stand upright like that was one of the things that made them really successful. It let them get to a lot of areas that other animals that existed at the time just couldn't. So narrowing this down within dinosaurs in particular is kind of tricky, because dinosaurs obviously have been extinct for 60 million years. So that means that what we typically use to sort them into groups is their skeletons, because that's all that we have. Which means that a lot of the kind of signature traits of dinosaurs are all internal, and so we're not seeing them on our logo that we're using here. As an example, there's kind of two big groups of dinosaurs. The next level below dinosaur are called Ornithischia, the bird hips, because they thought that their hip bones looked like bird hip bones. And Saurischia, the lizard hips, because they thought that their hip bones looked like lizard hips. We can't see the hip bones on our raptor, so that's not something we can really use.
Kind of funny thing with the Saurischia, Ornithischia thing that I don't think I talk about in this is that they called them lizard hips and bird hips, but actually had it backwards. And so as the initially early days of people thinking that birds are descended from dinosaurs, it was assumed that the birds were descended from ornithischian dinosaurs. But nowadays we know that they are descended from Saurischia dinosaurs. We know they're theropods. And so even though there is a group of dinosaurs that are called the bird hips, birds are not actually a part of the bird hips. They're a part of the lizard hips. It's hard to get names of things changed in science. You'll see that sometimes where a thing will get named a thing and it quits being right. but the name just sticks around because, like I said, it's hard to get the names changed.
So without anything really easy and definitive that we can point to that tells us for sure whether the raptor is an Ornithischia or Saurischia, we have to make sort of an educated guess. And one thing we can look at for that is, again, going back to the teeth that we used before. The raptor has very sharp teeth, which would imply that our raptor is a meat eater. And despite having kind of a fierce reputation, there's actually not very many dinosaurs that eat meat, and almost all of them belong to a group called the theropods, which are a type of Saurischian dinosaur.
And the theropods are kind of a unique group in that it kind of, in a lot of ways, has ended up being sort of a dump group for a lot of dinosaurs. Like, basically to the point where any meat-eating dinosaur just gets tossed in there. It has its defining characteristics, but there's some question marks around how well organized the theropods actually are right now, because, like I said, when they find a dinosaur and they're like, well, it's got sharp teeth, it must be a theropod, because they're the only ones that eat meat, pretty much. So it's a weird dinosaur sorting thing.
So I think we'll move forward, assuming that our raptor is in Saurischia, and most likely a theropod. And so within Saurischia, there are two different groups of dinosaurs. There are the theropods that I just mentioned, which is home to things like Tyrannosaurus rex, probably the most famous theropod. But there's another group in there called the sauropods, which is home to all of the big long neck dinosaurs. And generally the way you would sort those two groups is the sauropods are the ones that walk on 4 legs, and the theropods are the ones that walk on 2 legs. Obviously, our raptor is walking on 2 legs, so again, we can probably put him in the theropods. So our next big clue as far as placing our raptor is on the foot. So most theropods walked around with 3 toes on the ground. Our raptor actually is walking around with only 2 toes touching the ground, though, and you can see he's holding that 3rd toe up off the ground, and the claw is actually pointed upwards. This would be called a sickle claw, and this is something that one group called the dromaeosaurs would use when hunting. So that claw would be what they would use to make the sort of final killing blow on their prey. And so having that sickle claw puts it into the dromaeosaurs. And as far as just using the physical traits of the raptor, I think this is about as far as I can go. Getting it down to what we would call the family level is what the dromaeosaurs would be. We would call that a family. But there are actually a couple more tricks that I can pull out here and maybe narrow it down a little more. So, just knowing my history of the NBA and of the Toronto Raptors, I know that they were founded in the mid-90s sometime, and so presumably, if it was modeled after a specific dinosaur, it wouldn't be one that was unknown to science at that time. And that actually eliminates a lot of the dromaeosaurs. There's a lot of dromaeosaurs that have been discovered or described just within the last 20 years or so. And so if we assume that this is one that was named before 1995, that really narrows it down to either a velociraptor, a Utah raptor, or a Deinonychus. And they did also give us one last clue in the logo, and that's the basketball. If we assume that the basketball that the Toronto Raptor is dribbling is a regulation-sized NBA basketball, it should be about 9.5 inches in diameter, 9.5 inches at its widest point. And so if we stack a few of those basketballs up next to the Raptor, we can see that he is somewhere between 3 and 4 basketballs tall. It's kind of hunched over, so, we'll give him the benefit of the doubt and say if he was standing up straight, he'd be about 36 inches tall, about 3 feet tall. 3 feet tall is too big to be a velociraptor. Velociraptors are pretty close to the same size as like a house cat. And it's too small to be a Utah raptor. Utah raptors are pretty close in size to a human, somewhere between like 5 and 6 feet tall. But it actually pretty much matches up exactly right with the height of a Deinonychus. So I think we can say, with relative confidence, that the Toronto Raptor is meant to be based on a Deinonychus. And so, one last obvious thing is we're looking at our artist's depiction of a Deinonychus here. You'll probably notice that our Deinonychus has feathers. And that's something that, at the time that the original Toronto Raptors logo was being made, was probably something that scientists were probably thinking was true, but probably hadn't quite made its way out to the general public in a big way yet. So at the time, most dinosaurs were still being drawn kind of more lizardy, more scaly looking. But like I said, in modern understanding, we sort of know that a lot of these kind of raptor-y dinosaurs had feathers and ultimately become modern birds. So rather than looking like the raptor we see in the logo, a more accurate depiction would probably look a little bit more like this.
And shoutouts to Hannah Moss. I reached out to her on Twitter to use this logo in this video, and she was very supportive of me doing so and actually shared the video around a little bit herself afterwards. And so, just as one last postscript before we wrap up here, I thought it'd be interesting to see if the Toronto Raptors have ever put out any official information on what the Raptor on the jersey is meant to be. And it turns out that the Raptor is actually based off of a Velociraptor from the Jurassic Park movie. And the Jurassic Park movie is based off of the Michael Crichton book by the same name, which similarly used the Velociraptors in the same role that they're used in. But the thing about those Velociraptors is that they are actually based off of Deinonychus. And Michael Crichton just changed the name because he thought it was a cooler name that people would like more. The book was a huge success, the movie was a huge success, we got an NBA franchise named after it, so hard to say he was wrong on that. So I'm going to call that a win though. I'm going to say we got that right. I'm going to say that the Raptor is actually meant to be a Deinonychus, and I called that correctly, even though the name associated with it is not Deinonychus. But anyway, thank you all for watching, guys. That took me so many takes. The take I ended up with wasn't even good, but I sat there and recorded that and recorded that and recorded that, and mostly just gave up on it after a while. Just as kind of a editing logistical note here, this video is going to be going up on our YouTube channel, and this is been a much more time and labor-intensive video to make than any of the other ones that we put up on there before. So I'm really hoping it does well so we can rationalize making more of them. I've got a lot more stuff laying around my apartment that I would love to show you guys. But yeah, if you want to see more of this stuff, subscribe, all that, to the Headwaters Science Center's YouTube channel. Thank you guys. And that's that. So that's the... Whoops. That is the very first video that I made for HSC's YouTube. So, most of it still holds true. We still have a YouTube channel that we still upload stuff onto occasionally. We also stream on YouTube now, which maybe some of you are watching on. I'm not looking at that chat right now. I'm looking at the Facebook and Twitch chats. But if you thought that was interesting, like I said, there's a couple more of those. There's actually 2 more Ryan's rooms that are on there, which maybe at some point we'll go back and look at as well. I'm looking at making another one here. We've been kind of backlogged with making videos for outside folks for a while, so I haven't really gotten a chance to make one for HSC in a minute. But I'm looking forward to getting back into that, and now I actually have some real equipment at home that I can use rather than just recording everything off of my laptop. So got that to look forward to, I suppose. But anyway, we've been going for half an hour at this point. I think it's a pretty good time to start wrapping up. Those of you who stuck with me through all that, thanks for hanging out and watching. HSC is open right now from 9:30 to 5:30 on Friday, Saturday, and Monday, and from 1 to 5:30 on Sundays. We are just starting now to start booking groups again, in a limited capacity here at HSC as well. So if you have if you're a teacher, or a daycare person, or a Head Starter type of person, church group we had in the other day, and you're looking for somewhere to bring a smallish group of people, we are open. We are accepting scheduling groups right now. Otherwise, like I said, you can come in any of the times we're open, and if you come in at 3:30, generally we'll be out on the exhibit floor recording one of these live shows, and you can come and watch them in person live, and a lot of times it'll be an opportunity to actually come and participate as well, which is fun for us. We're kind of out of practice here at this point, to be honest. We haven't done very many live shows over the last year because COVID, so it's a good opportunity for us to get back into the swing of things. Good opportunity for you to get some extra little bonus content if you swing by at 3:30, and as I said, you might end up in one of our videos that goes up on our YouTube, or at the very least is streamed to Twitch and Facebook and all that. But otherwise, thanks for watching, everybody, and